Toronto Unveils 2025 budget, 6.9% tax hike to fund enhanced city services. Welcome to Regent Park TV. I'm Gabriel. Today we're covering the City of Toronto's launch of its 2025 budget. Mayor Olivia Chow and Budget Chief Councillor Shelley Carroll recently introduced a sweeping $18.8 billion operating budget, alongside a historic $59.6 billion capital plan, with a proposed 6.9% tax increase. This budget aims to fund key projects, including transit enhancements and housing initiatives, setting the stage for transformative improvements across the city.
Toronto is still recovering from over a decade of underinvestment, which left us vulnerable to face the challenges we face today. And we now have ourselves starting with a $1.2 billion opening shortfall, an improvement, but still a challenge. This budget builds on the foundation that we laid, and it continues that journey towards fiscal sustainability. And as the mayor has already described to you, it strengthens core services. It makes those targeted investments that we keep hearing from you are needed most. We hear that from Toronto residents and businesses daily. With the benefit of a full year of planning, this time we had that full year, and so we've conducted an even deeper review of departmental operations to identify efficiencies and savings while maintaining service levels across the board. This year alone, staff working together with the financial department have achieved $680 million in savings, reductions, along with offsets and efficiencies. And we know that more work must always be done in that regard, to be mindful of your tax dollars. That's why we'll continue that work. It goes on throughout the year. Through the year, we'll be achieving further savings wherever we find them possible. Thousands of Torontonians took part in this year's pre-budget consultation. That was a surprise to me. We thought that they wouldn't come back every year, and yet they did, stronger than ever. And their message was clear. Their priorities were affordable living in our city, safer streets, and better transit. And you've heard the mayor outline the response to that. So to achieve that balance, that strong financial foundation, while enhancing the critical services that you've told us about, staff are proposing a 5.4% property tax increase. This budget responds directly to those things you asked for. Under affordable living, there are significant investments in shelter, renter protections, and new housing initiatives, but we're also expanding access to affordable childcare and recreation programs, such things as opening swimming program facilities earlier and increasing library hours, better access for families and seniors to all of those programs. In safer streets, we are enabling even faster emergency response times than we achieved in 2024 by hiring hundreds, literally hundreds of new first responders. We have approved an unprecedented multi-year hiring plan to put more police officers on our streets every year for 3 years. More traffic wardens to protect vulnerable road users and improve traffic flow, and continued investments across the Vision Zero initiative to prevent fatalities and serious injuries in our streets. And better transit, you heard a lot about in last year's TTC budget launch. Further expansion of service hours, that improves reliability and capacity. Purchasing those 55 new streetcars to keep growing the capacity to meet those needs. And we're also investing in our stations and vehicles to make them cleaner and brighter and safer. We're also making significant progress on the capital front. Our state of good repair backlog. This is all work that is supported by another 1.5% increase to the city building levy, and partnership from other orders of government is so key here. But with this budget, our roadmap, our 10-year plan, Torontonians will feel the city getting better in the years to come.
The proposed 6.9% tax increase translates to an average monthly increase of $17.50 for residents. While this marks a notable rise, Mayor Chow emphasized that the investment will significantly improve city services, including maintaining frozen transit fares, extending recreational facility hours, and preventing renovictions through enhanced housing support.
We're working to keep Toronto moving. Waiting 20 minutes for a bus or streetcar, experiencing the subway slow zones, or being packed like sardines on shuttle buses when the subways go down isn't acceptable. People deserve better, and the TDC must be the better way. So last week, I announced we are freezing TDC fares while delivering better and faster service. And we are making the largest 10-year capital investment in transit infrastructure ever. With the help of the Provincial New Deal and Ottawa, plus the city's building fund started a decade ago, the order is going in to buy new subway cars for Line 2, finally.
The budget process includes multiple public consultations and committee reviews. Residents are encouraged to participate, ensuring that the final budget reflects community priorities. By law, the final budget must be presented by February 1st, with a council vote scheduled for February 11th. The 2025 budget is a significant development for Regent Park and the surrounding neighborhoods, as it directly addresses many community needs like affordable housing, public safety, and community services. Now, let's dive into the full video of the Budget Committee meeting and media briefing. In this presentation, city officials break down the key details of the 2025 budget and discuss the plans and challenges that lie ahead for Toronto.
Chair, thank you, and that's quite an introduction to our presentation. Thank you for that as well. It's our pleasure to be here this morning to present an overview of the 2025 budget. I want to first start by thanking this committee for its ongoing work with our budget process. And as we get into the presentation, I want to thank our Chief Financial Officer and Treasurer, Steve Conforti, and his team for all the work that they have put into it. I'll provide a brief overview in the first few slides and then turn it over to our CFO for his longer context in both the operating and capital budgets. So let's jump right in. The 2025 budget highlights are that we have, as we're required to do and as we do each year, and we're presenting today a balanced budget. On the operating side, it's a budget of $18.8 billion, which is an increase from last year. And on the capital side, nearly $60 billion, also an increase from 2024. We'll go into why those increases are there and what's happening with those. But I do want to thank all of the folks across the city who have contributed to building this year's budget. The operating budget is supported by a recommended 5.4% residential property tax increase. The capital budget, of course, as was Council's decision, is continuing to be supported by a 1.5% increase to the city building fund. That combined puts the property tax increase for 2025 at 6.9%. There are a number of investments that match with what we've been hearing through the budget consultations, what we've been hearing through the citywide survey that was conducted in August and September around priorities here in the city. And it does align with the multi-year approach we're taking towards our budgeting, as well as the work that we're doing with other orders of government, in particular with our provincial partners that I'll talk about in just a few minutes, to help make sure that we move towards a sustainable future. In all, our goal is to continue to advance a more resilient and sustainable financial future. We mentioned last year that this was going to take us a few years to do, and we are on track to make that happen. If we move to the next slide, I do want to present to you today that the approach that we outlined for you last year is working, and we can see a future forward that puts the City of Toronto on a much stronger financial footing. We will go into detail around the continuing partnerships that we need in order to achieve that success, but I can tell you that the plan today is working. In 2024, you'll recall, we opened with a budget pressure of $1.8 billion, the largest that anyone can remember, and certainly one that we could not close without the support of other orders of government helping us. And as you know, that came through. I'm pleased to note that in 2025, although still a large opening pressure at $1.2 billion, you can see the decline. And this slide indicates that our projections for 2026 and 2027 have this opening pressure continuing to decline based on the work that we're doing that's outlined in the bullet points across 2024 this past year, 2025, our current year, and into 2026 and beyond. Our long-term financial plan clearly laid out that this was going to take a few years to happen if we wanted to ensure there were not dramatic changes to service levels across the City of Toronto. And I can state to you today that the service levels and our services that we provide to the people who live, work, play, and learn in the City of Toronto continue to be at a level that people have seen in the past, and in targeted areas we've seen continued new investments. So this multi-year approach will require us to continue to work on our financial strategies, both on an operating and capital side, but we do see a time as early as 2027 where our opening pressure is much more in line with what we've seen in the past. One of the things you will note in our budget is a rather large increase in the gross expenditures from an operating perspective, from $17 billion to $18.8 billion. And if you simply do the math on that increase, it's 10.5%. I want to be very clear, and why we've included this slide is to be very clear that that is a gross change in our budget, which is very much impacted by some flow-throughs that we have from other orders of government. It is not a reflection on the increased city expenditures, which you can see from this slide, are more in line with about a 3.8% increase. So let's talk about why that gross number is so large. There are a number of initiatives that we receive funding from, really as a flow-through from other orders of government. One of the largest, and it's a good news story, is about $570 million in new funding under the Canada-wide Early Learning and Childcare Program. This provides for a more affordable childcare in this city, as is happening across communities across this country. So at $570 million, that has no impact on the property taxpayers of the City of Toronto. That is a good news story of our work with other orders of government. Other impacts in this area are really a sign of the times. The reality is our caseloads for Ontario Works and are up, and as a result, the 100% contribution from the province of Ontario to the social assistance payments that are received by individuals in our community are again put into the city's budget. Because of the times that we're living in, those expenditures are up. Our caseloads are up. So while not a great news story, the fact that more money is flowing into the city, again, does not impact the property taxpayer. There are also internal transfers that happen that make up some of this $18.8 billion. One of the examples that you see now in a consolidated budget for the first time in 2025 is our work on the FIFA event in 2026. There is one budget that shows you how those expenses are rolling out from a year-to-year process matched against the $380 million budget. But of course, the work happens across many divisions and agencies, boards, and corporations. And so that work then has to be transferred, and those resources transferred to those budgets so the work can actually happen. Another example is the increased rates that we're collecting for Toronto Water. Some of those are being transferred to the capital program. And again, those internal transfers make up in total about $336 million of that gross change. So I do want to focus on what is around increased city expenditures, about $650 million. And as I say, if you looked at it from a year-over-year increase perspective, about 3.8%. About 90% of those increased costs are across some very few areas, but very important areas for the City of Toronto. Our transit services, our emergency services, our the largest social housing provider in the country in Toronto Community Housing. And of course, in 2025, we are in a collective agreement year, and we are settling with many of our unions. We've done some of those settlements, and some of them are ongoing. So when you look at those increased costs, those are the areas that account for most of it. And the reality is that is what we need in order to keep our city moving forward. So again, I know the story will be, look at the huge increase in expenditures by the City of Toronto. We've provided this slide so that we can all communicate clearly that much of that is a flow through of other orders of government, some of which is very good news for this community, and that when it comes to increased city expenditures, there's a strong rationale for why we're investing in the areas that we are, that make up 90% of that increase, and overall, a decent level of increase matched to the amount of service that we need to provide. So I did want to spend just a few minutes on that, Chair. As we move forward, there are some fundamentals in our budget that remain unchanged. And on this next slide, you can see the impact of our work and our investments in this community on the provincial and national scale. The reality is that as Toronto is stronger, so is Ontario, and so is our country. We account for 1 in every 5 jobs in Ontario. We account, as you heard last year, and continue to account for about 20% of the GDP of this country and over 50% of the GDP in this province. We welcome more than 26 million visitors annually. We have a massive capital program that provides jobs and investments in key sectors from an economic perspective. And those that do business in this city generate billions annually in income, corporate, and sales taxes to other orders of government. We always put the chart on the right side of this slide in just to remind folks that from a tax perspective and a revenue perspective through taxes, municipalities, including Toronto, receive a tiny share of those revenues based on compared to other orders of government. So our impact, provincially and federally, has not changed. And therefore, the fact that we need to work together has not changed as well. If you remember when the long-term financial plan came forward in 2023, as we look forward to a 2024 budget, it was very clear that the City of Toronto has things that they needed to do, and the City of Toronto has responded. We have found ways in order to make sure that our budgets are as efficient and effective as possible, and that our investments and our use of the tools that we have to generate resources and revenues are used as wisely as possible. But we needed other orders of government to come to the table and help. Of course, we were all very pleased with the success of the New Deal, as they were called, conversations with the provincial government. And while there were also some federal contributions that came, I really want to focus in on what the work that happened between our mayor and the premier of this province, and the work that was flowed to us to complete as civil servants to create the New Deal that was signed off in late 2023 and helped us in our 2024 budget. This slide gives you a sense of some of those investments that were there and what they needed to do to help us address. In 2024, that operating pressure simply would not have been closed had we not had a significant contribution from the provincial government. And we can't thank them enough for investing in those areas that we clearly articulated through our long-term financial plan had a uniqueness in Toronto that simply did not exist in other municipalities across this province. Those areas included transit. Those areas included housing and homelessness. And those areas included our massive issues around capital work. So we do have operating funding guaranteed over a 3-year period in those areas. Operating dollars for transit, operating dollars for our shelter system. And in addition to that, we've also been able to achieve funding through funds that have been set up for all municipalities, such as the Building Faster Fund. And that is a result of us meeting and exceeding, in some cases, our housing targets. And I'm pleased to say in 2024, it appears that we will once again be strong in terms of matching against our housing target. But we know that tougher times are ahead in 2025 as we try to continue to build the housing that's required for this community. It also goes without saying that the fact the province is uploading to their oversight the Gardiner Expressway and Don Valley Parkway provided an immediate relief in 2 ways to the City of Toronto. First of all, it will eliminate the single largest state of good repair impact on our budget that we had. That stretch of road is the single largest capital project in terms of its impact on state of good repair. So secondly, we were able over the 10-year period to invest those resources in other categories of capital spending that also have pressures on state of good repair. And the good work of Council to recognize those areas means that we are underway in allowing parts of our organization to have increased resources to address state of good repair. Again, that partnership with the provincial government has allowed us to make a $1.9 billion investment in state of good repair over the next 10 years that we simply would not have been able to make without that partnership. And I know that you mentioned, Chair, at the beginning of the meeting that, Gary Crawford is here with us. And as you know, we are committed to continuing our work with the New Deal. The province has committed in 2025 to begin the discussions around what the future New Deal will look like. And we'll continue to work with our provincial counterparts, including Mr. Crawford in his new role with the provincial government as he acts as an advisor to government around this New Deal. So that's the good news around the New Deal that came forward. And I do want to acknowledge, of course, the federal government coming forward and helping us, particularly with funding for refugee and asylum seekers who are accessing our shelter system. And at the very tail end of 2024, the announcement that we have now completed the three-way investment strategy to ensure the acquisition of 55 new subway cars for Line 2 of the TTC. So that's the good news, but our challenges remain. And this slide shows just some of those challenges that remain for the City of Toronto. Quite rightly, people have pointed out that even with the success of the New Deal in 2023, heading into our 2024 budget, it did not change some of these systemic challenges in the long term. That is what we will be continuing to discuss with other orders of government. We, in some cases, operate the largest systems in the country and some of the largest in North America from a service perspective. We continue to have pressures on our city that simply don't exist in other places in Ontario or across this country. And like all municipalities, Toronto has limited revenue tools, and they are largely disconnected from economic growth, as we would say, without access to taxes that grow in terms of income taxes or in terms of sales taxes. We have a heavy reliance on property taxes, and that is simply not sustainable. We understand that. We've articulated it for years. Long before I joined the City of Toronto, this has been clearly articulated, and it once again was articulated in 2023 in our long-term financial plan. The other piece that we know in terms of both budget and programming is that we continue to rise to the challenge time after time in the City of Toronto. We continue to operate these programs that are the largest in the country, that have some of the most complex issues that they respond to in the country. And we continue to do that with the investment of Torontonians in many, many different ways. We continue to invest in our capital program, and you'll see this year again, continue to raise that investment as we continue to maintain critical infrastructure and address our state of good repair. But the reality is that as things confront this community, we will need those continued partnerships if we are to continue to deliver the services Torontonians expect. That is why we continue to say and point back to our long-term financial plan. Toronto has work that it needs to do and will continue to do. You have been very clear with what you want us to try and achieve in terms of financial sustainability and service level delivery. But the reality is, if we are to be fully sustainable from a financial perspective, we will need the support of other orders of government. I want to conclude with looking at the results that were delivered and a snapshot of some of the results that were delivered from the 2024 investment achieved through the budget and achieved by our city. This slide highlights some key areas. These are key areas that continue to come forward from our consultation and survey work of where those that live, work, and do business in the city want us to make investments. It's also clear from a council perspective where your priorities are, and they match with the strategic priorities that you have set for us as our governing body. We do invest in public safety across our emergency services, and it is seeing results. A 5.7-minute reduction in police response time is something that is very pleasing for all of us to see. The fact now that residents everywhere in the City of Toronto have access to the Toronto Community Crisis Service means there is a non-police alternative for those experiencing issues of mental health. From a roads perspective, we know that we need to keep our roads infrastructure working, and we're doing that by filling more potholes, by ensuring that we do everything in our power to deal with congestion management as we also make unprecedented capital investments across our city. From a transit perspective, more hours of service are available and transit fares are frozen, part of a response to the affordability challenges that Torontonians speak of each and every day. Our affordable housing program has been invested in 2024 in ways that are both consistent with our overall approaches on our 10-year housing plan, but also in new ways as we're confronted with new realities and new challenges to building housing in this community. Most recently, in the fall of 2024, reports that provided incentives to develop more than 12,000 new rental homes. And across our community, Torontonians are able to access more services that make sense, sometimes to our most vulnerable and sometimes to all of those who enjoy this great city. It can be increased nutrition through school food programs. It is the fact that many more of our libraries are open 7 days a week. An increase of Sunday service is something that has been talked about for a while, and we are now seeing it happen within our library system. We have more bookings available in our recreation centers, including more spaces for people in those traditional programs that people clamor for each and every year, and more drop-in hours for those that wish to simply come and enjoy our fantastic recreational facilities. And for our young people, which will be a theme again in 2025's budget, we now have more youth hubs up and running as places for young people to invest in. So I conclude by saying that we are on a pathway where we can see the march towards sustainability. As we develop each year's budgets, we are very clear to try and find ways that we can suggest how we match our priorities from a community perspective and from a council perspective in terms of the budget that we produce. But I need to make it very clear as I turn things over to our Chief Financial Officer, this pathway to success will only be possible if we have those continued partnerships, not only with the taxpayers of the City of Toronto, but also with other orders of government who will be critical to our success in the long term. Thanks, and over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Paul. And before I start, I'd like to extend my thanks to our Budget Chair, Councillor Carroll, and Budget Committee members for all your support in this year's process. I'd also like to take a moment to extend my thanks to staff across the organization that have supported the budget development and helped us get to this point today. That has to start with our Executive Director of Financial Planning, Althea Hutchinson, who has been a valued partner to me and the architect behind this year's budget. And of course, I need to extend that thanks to our entire team in Financial Planning Division. I'd also like to thank Cindy Williamson, just to my left, and all my supports in the Office of the CFO, and all of the finance leads across our organization, where we worked closely with Annalisa Mignardi, Marco Cuoco, Alan Cohen, and Vivian Ching, and their respective teams to prepare the 2025 budget. Collectively, we are now ready to launch a balanced budget for 2025. This year's budget continues to address our financial challenges through a multi-year approach that began last year and is already demonstrating positive progress. We began the process with a $1.2 billion opening pressure that has been addressed through continued actions from our long-term financial plan, planned bridging strategies consistent with our multi-year approach, $680 million in reductions in offsets identified through our review process. And ultimately, it's supported by a 5.4% residential property tax increase specific to the operating budget. While developing this year's budget, we were committed to maintaining critical services and service levels and continuing to apply the benefits achieved through our various partnerships with the federal and provincial governments. We again had an opportunity to hear from the public prior to our budget launch today. We heard from 763 residents as part of budget consultation sessions and garnered over 12,000 responses to our online budget survey. Through these consultations, we heard what was most important to our residents were investments in making life affordable, providing community service, getting Toronto moving, and keeping people safe. And while the budget primarily aims to maintain and preserve services and continue down a path towards enhanced fiscal sustainability, we have also made critical new investments totaling $94 million in these areas most valued by our residents. As we began work on the 2025 budget, we also had to consider with bringing forward a balanced budget, both those challenges that are unique to municipal budgeting or unique to the City of Toronto itself. Like other municipalities, we have limited revenue options with a heavy reliance on property tax revenue that, unlike sales tax or income tax, is relatively static outside of an annual rate change. While there is limited natural growth in our revenue base, we continue to experience both added costs to deliver municipal services, as well as growing demand for our services driven by population growth and an aging demographic. On top of that, Toronto has unique challenges above and beyond our peers, arising from operations of our transit system and increasing demand and complexities for our shelter and social services. That said, we are presenting a balanced budget, and I'll take you through the next few slides to highlight the actions that we've taken to make that happen. We are presenting an operating budget of $18.8 billion in gross expenditures. This includes $16.6 billion, or 88% of the overall budget for our tax-supported programs, and $2.2 billion, or 12%, for our rate-supported programs, which include Toronto Water, Solid Waste, and the Parking Authority. Total expenditures of $18.8 billion in the 2025 combined tax and rate-supported operating budgets reflect a $1.8 billion increase from the 2024 budget. However, as Paul noted earlier, when adjusting for added flow-through funding from the federal and provincial governments like the Early Learning and Childcare Program, and adjusting for our own internal transfers, a more accurate reflection of increased operating expenditures from the city would be $654 million, or a 3.8% increase compared to last year. This slide shows the total gross and net budget for 2025 with the full length of the bar depicting the total spend for 2025 and the yellow bars representing the amount of property tax funding dedicated to delivering those services. As reflected in this table, we continue to spend a significant amount on the city's cost-shared social programs with a total of $5.1 billion in 2025. This includes programs which receive contributions from other orders of government such as Toronto Employment and Social Services, Children's Services, Shelter Support, Housing, Toronto Community Housing, and also includes long-term care homes and public health. I won't speak to all the categories, but I'll quickly note more than $2.8 billion in spending is for transit services, which is the next major spending category. Next are our rate programs, reflecting 12% of total investments, then the police budget with $1.4 billion in total spend. The $1.27 billion in capital financing support, with about $970 million in debt servicing costs and nearly $300 million in capital from current funding. I'll also point out corporate accounts with $1.25 billion includes expenses incurred on behalf of the entire organization, such as insurance and employee-related liabilities. This is also where we capture corporate revenue, such as dividends, land transfer tax, which is why the budget reflects an overall net revenue in the graphic. We've shown this slide over the last few years, and it captures the historical opening budget pressure the city has faced on an annual basis that's had to be addressed to ultimately present a balanced budget. Traditionally, the city would experience about a $600 million opening pressure. What is important about this slide is actually 2024, where the nearly $1.8 billion pressure wasn't as significant as the pressures that we faced during the pandemic, but the key difference was there was no longer any expected COVID support funding included in our budget, and all the remaining sustained pandemic impacts, coupled with significant growth and inflationary impacts, needed to be fully addressed by our property tax base and other available city revenues. Given the magnitude of that opening pressure and to avoid otherwise necessary reductions to critical city services, we introduced a multi-year strategy to successfully transition these pressures, including sustained COVID impacts, to be permanently funded within the city's budget in a way where we could, over time, get our annual opening budget pressure back in the range of $700 to $800 million. As you can see with the 2025 opening pressure of $1.2 billion, our strategy, coupled with provincial support from the New Deal, is working. In fact, the multi-year approach was specifically referenced as one of the reasons given by our credit rating agency when we received our first credit rating increase in decades last year. While we're on the right path, we were still faced with a $1.2 billion opening pressure in 2025, which is double our traditional experience of $600 million and needs to be offset to achieve a balanced budget. So this is an updated version of a slide that we've used in our budget consultation processes and aims to provide a visual representation of the budget challenges we face in 2025. The large red tower that you see on the left of the graphic represents to scale the 2025 opening budget pressure of $1.2 billion. That much smaller green box Just to the right of it reflects $46.4 million in annual revenue that is generated from every 1% residential property tax increase. So, and only to provide perspective, to fully offset a $1.2 billion pressure through a property tax change alone, we would have required a 26% residential property tax increase. Now, the other towers you see provide a to-scale visual of the portion of property tax funding that supports municipal services we provide in Toronto. So alternatively, if we were to have approached the 2025 budget through program reductions alone, we would need to eliminate expenses equivalent to the full cost of our transit service in the city. That would include subways, streetcars, buses, and even Wheel-Trans service to bring forward a balanced budget. So obviously, we didn't take either of those actions, and I'll take you through the approach that we have taken to bring forward a balanced budget in 2025. Excuse me. We are presenting a balanced budget with the continued lens of a multi-year approach through 5 key balancing actions. First, as we always do as part of the annual budget process, staff review budget submissions and identify potential opportunities for offsets, efficiencies, and other revenue actions. This year, those actions totaled $680 million in offsets, which, when factoring both $152 million in opportunities identified as part of the budget submissions and a further $528 million in offsets identified post-submission during our internal review process. These actions include $93 million from line-by-line program reviews, where we look at each expenditure category and specific commitment items to ensure budgets reflect both prior year actual spending and our expectations in 2025. We also have $41 million in efficiencies. This includes great work by our staff in shelter and support services to drive savings from renegotiated hotel contracts, efforts from our teams in corporate services, where technology services either decommission or renegotiated pricing on system applications, and fleet services, who introduced a series of actions from retreading of tires to reassigning underutilized vehicles. Even our credit rating increase, achieved through our prudent fiscal management and the Ontario-Toronto New Deal, results in reductions in debt servicing costs. $294 million was also achieved through our program and agency reviews following budget submissions. Both our financial planning and program staff work collaboratively to validate all budget assumptions and estimates, providing essentially a challenge function. This includes prioritization of expenditures, considering affordability, and validating timing and cost assumptions. We also included $219 million in offsets through revenue adjustments, arising from a combination of inflation and volume changes to user fee revenue, and expected increases within our corporate revenues, like investment income and our land transfer tax. Our second action includes $41 million from continued realization of additional offsets achieved from actions implemented as part of our long-term financial plan. This includes added revenue from the graduated municipal land transfer tax rates on high-value properties, and revenues expected from the newly implemented non-resident speculation tax. Third, our balancing actions factor $330 million in multi-year bridging strategies, which represent planned reserve draws that were designed to be temporary measures to strategically manage the pressure we face over the next few years. As these bridging strategies are reversed in 2026 and 2027, they'll be replaced through other planned actions that are expected to materialize over the next few years, predominantly those arising as part of the long-term financial plan. Fourth, the 2025 operating budget incorporates $250 million in additional revenue generated from a property tax rate increase of 5.4%. And lastly, consistent with our recent experience, we expect continued federal funding to offset added costs for refugee claimant response. This year's budget was heavily influenced by a series of public consultation sessions held this past fall. Initiated by the mayor and the budget chair, the city hosted a month-long engagement campaign, including the online survey and various consultation sessions for residents to participate in. In total, the city received over 12,000 responses to our online budget survey. We also got to meet with 763 participants at 6 different sessions, including in-person and virtual options across the city. An additional 313 participants joined in a local meeting hosted by community organizations within Indigenous, Black, and equity-deserving communities. Major themes that were identified by the public that coincide with where we have made added investments include making life affordable, with a focus on affordable housing and for costs associated with transit, childcare, and food. Getting Toronto moving, expanding and improving reliability and accessibility of the TTC and traffic infrastructure. Providing community services, needs for enhanced programming at parks, libraries, and community centers, as well as climate action programs. And keeping people safe, prioritizing violence prevention and proactive measures, as well as increased funding for emergency services. The 2025 budget includes additional spending of $94 million in new and enhanced initiatives in areas consistent with what we heard during public consultations. For making life affordable, we're supporting over 8,000 students in school food programs. We're supporting over 31,000 youth in Camp TO food programs, and added 300 households that will be supported through the Rent Bank program. For Getting Toronto Moving, the TTC budget includes funding for about 500,000 additional hours of transit service. Funding is also included for pilot projects aimed to reduce bunching and gapping on key bus and streetcar routes. We're also continuing to add traffic agents. We will now have 100 agents, 4 times more than what we had at this time last year, which will continue to help improve travel times in key corridors. We're providing community services, expanding Sunday service hours that will now be available at over 70 libraries, investing in keeping our recreation facilities cleaner, which was a key feedback we heard from the public, and making outdoor pools available for an extra 2 hours daily. We're also keeping people safe, continuing to invest in emergency services with 276 added positions between fire, police, and paramedic services, while at the same time also investing in youth violence prevention programs. Advancing financial sustainability for the city while preserving critical city services requires us to continue to develop our budget through a multi-year approach. Our current estimated opening pressure for 2026 is approximately $1.07 billion. This includes the reversal of many of our bridging strategies, full-year costs for 2025 enhancements, and expected growth and inflationary pressures. We expect the city's opening pressure could be further reduced to as low as $734 million by 2027, which is far closer to our historical experience and sets the stage for enhanced financial sustainability within our operating budget. Absent any new or unforeseen pressures, this can be achieved by 2027 within our multi-year plan through the phased reversal of temporary budget bridging strategies, further implementation of remaining long-term financial plan actions, the continued identification of additional annual offsets and reductions like the $680 million identified this year, and consistent with our multi-year approach, we have assumed multi-year tax rate scenarios that do not reflect any approved plan but does support for modeling purposes. It is important to note that we will begin to see the reversal of the New Deal funding in 2027 when our current 3-year agreement comes to an end. That said, we continue to benefit from strong collaboration with our provincial partners, and initial actions have already begun and are underway to develop the New Deal 2.0 well in advance of the pressure noted in the outlook. As noted, the 2025 operating budget incorporates a residential property tax rate increase of 5.4%. This equates to an annual increase of $210 to the average home, which has an assessed value of about $692,000, or the equivalent of $17.50 monthly. And just for clarity, because I do get asked this quite often, the current assessed value for all residential properties in the city that is used for property tax purposes is accurate at $692,000. The reason why it differs from the average sale price of a home in Toronto is because the current assessed value is based on property valuations conducted in 2016, which is the most recent assessment by the Municipal Property Assessment Corporation, or MPAC for short, for municipalities in Ontario. I'd also like to note that the city maintains property tax relief programs, including the tax increase deferral program and the tax increase cancellation programs. In 2024, these programs benefited over 10,000 households, and since 2015 has provided $44 million in tax relief. For multi-residential properties, the budget reflects an increase of 2.7%, which is half of the residential rate. This rate was considered with provincial rent guidelines in mind, ensuring it is below thresholds that would enable rent increases above provincial guidelines. We've also introduced a new multi-residential subclass that will be available to new multi-residential developments and provide a 15% reduction from the current residential rates. This slide highlights proposed property tax rate increases incorporated in the operating budget for business properties. The operating budget reflects an increase of 5.4% for industrial properties and 2.7% for commercial properties. The commercial rate increase is half our residential increase, consistent with provincial regulations related to tax ratio thresholds. Since 2022, the city has also maintained a small business property tax subclass, which provides a 15% rate reduction to eligible properties. This program, which was expanded last year, currently benefits over 28,000 small businesses. Back in December, City Council approved interim rate increases of 3.75% for both Toronto Water and Solid Waste Management Services, which include water and wastewater consumption rates and solid waste rates and fees. The prepared budget before you today confirms those rates with no change to the 3.75%. This will result in an average annual increase of $39 based on a 230 cubic meters of water consumed, and it will result in an average of $11 to $21 for single-family homes, depending on the size of their garbage bins. Okay, I'm now going to take us through the capital budget and plan. The 10-year capital budget totals nearly $60 billion, with $5.2 billion in spending in 2025 alone. This is the city's largest ever capital plan, and by a significant amount. The city's capital plan is increased by nearly $10 billion, or 20% compared to just last year's plan. The budget enables added, critical, and key investments in areas like transit and transportation infrastructure, aging city facilities that are critical to providing community services, and housing, flood protection, and net zero initiatives. Informed by our capital asset management plan and our capital prioritization framework, the 10-year capital plan not just prioritizes investments in critical state of good repair funding, but really moves the needle on addressing our SOGR backlog. 54% of planned spending, or $32.4 billion of the $60 billion capital plan, is dedicated to SOGR investments. This represents a 31% increase in SOGR funding over the last 2 years alone, and while the SOGR backlog is still expected to grow, we're now starting to see the flattening of that growth curve. This year's budget also continues to enhance our climate focus. Climate mitigation and adaptation actions aim to reduce over 160,000 tons of CO2 emissions, which is a 69% increase from the 2024 plan. And we continue to have great success with our sustainable debenture programs, with the issuance of both green bonds and social bonds to support finance capital infrastructure. The city is able to make significant increases in capital investments while maintaining a balanced plan and staying within our 15% debt service ratio. We've been able to do this through the incredible partnership secured with the province through the New Deal that has enabled the city to reallocate $1.9 billion in funding that was intended for the Gardiner Expressway to critical SOGR needs in the city, as well as provincial contributions towards new Line 2 subway cars that was unlocked thanks to the federal government and the Canada Public Transit Fund, with an expected $1.2 billion allocated to the City of Toronto. Furthermore, the budget continues to maximize the use of non-debt financing strategies wherever possible. And lastly, the capital budget continues to be supported by an added 1.5% levy increase for the City Building Fund, which is leveraged to support critical investments in transit and housing. Similar to the operating budget, we began on this year's capital program with consideration of challenges unique to our capital needs. On the demand side, we have to consider both the impact of our aging infrastructure on the cost and ability to maintain city services, as well as the need to make infrastructure investments that support a growing population and increased demand for city services. We also have to consider capacity. When I say that, I mean the capacity to deliver capital work, our financial capacity to support capital needs that extend beyond our sole financial reach, and how we prioritize capital work in the context of rising capital costs. I'll take you through the next few slides to highlight how we had to navigate these challenges while at the same time bringing forward the city's largest ever investment in capital infrastructure. Briefly, The 10-year gross capital plan is $59.6 billion. This includes $40.2 billion, or 67%, for our tax-supported programs, and $19.4 billion, or 33%, for our rate-supported programs of Toronto Water, Solid Waste, and the Parking Authority. The capital plan of nearly $60 billion will guide decisions on what investments will be made to purchase, build, and repair city infrastructure. Looking at key investments in this chart, you see that $17.6 billion, or 28% of our capital plan, is directed to water and wastewater infrastructure and stormwater investments, which is predominantly supported through water rate revenue and planned annual rate increases and has no reliance on tax-based funding. The city's highest investment of tax-based funding is in transit. At $17 billion, this represents 26% of the total capital plan. And with the considerable added investments made in this year's plan, has nearly surpassed Toronto Water as our largest area of capital investment. The city is also committed to spending $4.5 billion in housing, coupled with a further $4.5 billion in foregone revenue, provided to incentivize the development of affordable homes and rent-controlled homes. In addition, we continue to advocate for funding from other orders of government to further increase Toronto's housing supply. We're also investing a further $6.1 billion in transportation and mobility through investments in roads, in bridge repair, and in safety infrastructure. The city will also spend $5.2 billion on environment and recreation initiatives. This includes investments within parks, waterfront revitalization, environment and energy, as well as the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority. Our large area of capital funding is from water rate revenue totaling $16.1 billion, which speaks to the success we have had in directing annual water rate increases to support investments in water infrastructure. Traditional tax-supported debt funding totals $10.5 billion, and while we've added debt funding this year, our debt service costs remain under 15% in each year of the plan. In addition to traditional tax-supported debt, the City Building Fund contributes $8.5 billion, or 14% of total capital investments, and is applied against transit and housing initiatives. Rounding out debt funding, we have about $1.6 billion funded through recoverable debt, which will be serviced through additional revenue sources generated through those capital investments. These three debt-related sources total over $20 billion, or 34% of all funding in the 10-year capital plan. Moving down the chart, development charges fund about $6.1 billion, or 10% of our total capital funding. These are dedicated to growth-related investments. Our capital plan also leverages enhanced funding partnerships with the Government of Canada and Province of Ontario, with total combined funding of $8 billion, reflecting over 13% of total capital funding. There's a further $3.6 billion in capital from current funding, and reserve funds, excluding draws from water, development charge, and city building fund reserves, account for $3.5 billion in capital funding. This level of funding is consistent with commitments against city reserves, where annual contributions are made, often through the operating budget, to support planned capital investments. An example includes fleet reserve contributions that support vehicle procurement plans in the capital budget. There is an added 1.5% levy increase specific to the capital program and for the City Building Fund, which will result in an annual increase of $58 for the average home, or the equivalent of $4.86 each month. Consistent with Council's endorsement in 2023 and how the 10-year capital plan was developed, an annual levy increase of 1.5% is expected each year until 2035 for the City Building Fund. And with the continued growth in the city's capital plan, the City Building Fund remains critical in supporting priority investments. The City Building Fund levy is specifically dedicated to support transit and housing investments in our capital plan, and in 2025, the City Building Fund is expected to generate $384 million in revenue. To date, $1.4 billion in investments have been spent or committed due to the City Building Fund, and as you heard in our previous slides, will support an additional $8.5 billion in capital investments over the next 10 years. As I mentioned earlier, the capital plan is increased by nearly $10 billion, or 20% compared to last year. About half of that increase has been directed towards investments in transit and transportation. For TTC alone, the capital plan is over $16 billion, about 34% increase from last year, and about 150% increase from a capital plan that was only $6.5 billion in 2018, which was just before the development of the TTC's original capital investment plan. With this added level of investment supported by added funding from our partners in the federal and provincial governments, we're able to acquire 55 replacement subway cars for Line 2. $1.2 billion will be invested to purchase about 700 e-buses and 950 charging systems. $1 billion is being added for investments in both critical subway infrastructure repair, like signals, electrical and communication systems, and climate adaptation, resiliency, and efficiency measures. We're also adding $500 million to overhaul programs for buses, streetcars, and subways. At the same time, we're making added investments in transportation services with an added $380 million for city bridge and road rehabilitation. Consistent with what we heard from our residents, we're also investing an added $2 billion in housing and community improvements. This includes $400 million to advance data-good repair efforts in our recreation facilities, $349 million in a combination of added direct investments and incentives to enable housing supply and build more affordable homes. We continue to invest in repairing TCHC buildings with an added $300 million investment in this year's plan. And we have also added a further $223 million to continue to advance our homelessness service capital infrastructure strategy. Investments in state-of-good repair continue to be a city priority. $32.4 billion, or 54% of all planned capital spending over the next 10 years, will be on state-of-good repair initiatives. This reflects an increase of $6 billion over what was identified in the 2024 capital plan. In fact, Council has had to recently make some very tough decisions on where to invest in capital, and the prudent financial management that Council has demonstrated has enabled the city to increase SOGR funding by 31% over the last 2 years alone. In addition to that, our SOGR investments have been informed by our capital asset management plan with added investment in areas where our backlog was growing at a pace which was significantly greater than our level of investment. Based on this, we have prioritized SOGR funding in areas like transit, community housing, transportation, city facilities, and park and recreation infrastructure. On top of that, the City Building Fund has continued to help us further mitigate transit and housing SOGR pressures. And lastly, as a direct result of the Provincial New Deal, we've been able to remove the city's single largest SOGR liability in the form of the Gardiner Expressway and redirect $1.9 billion in funding relief to critical infrastructure renewal. As this slide demonstrates, the Gardiner upload has enabled us to redirect relief funding to other SOGR needs. Through this reallocation, we've been able to add $500 million to the TTC, $420 million to Parks, Forestry, and Recreation, $380 million to Transportation Services, $300 million to Toronto Community Housing, and $200 million to city facilities within our corporate real estate management budget. These also happen to be the program areas where, despite our ongoing efforts, our SOGR needs have been significantly outpacing our level of investment. Even with the added investments I've described, the city's SOGR backlog is still growing. We have a backlog of $9.4 billion at the end of 2024 that is expected to increase to $18 billion by 2034. However, with this year's added investment, not only do we see an initial decrease in our backlog, but we're starting to see the flattening of that growth curve. We're still expecting our backlog to grow by about $8.6 billion over the next 10 years, but that is a 29% decrease in our forecasted growth from this time last year. Not only does this added investment enable us to address critical backlog needs, but through this investment, we can enhance the reliability of our capital assets, reduce reactive maintenance costs, and with the cost escalation we've recently seen in our capital work, the earlier we can address required capital work, the less it will ultimately cost the city. This change demonstrates Council's commitment to prioritizing SOGR investments, and we will continue to leverage all the tools and strategies available to us to seek further gains against our SOGR backlog moving forward. The capital plan also continues to be developed with a climate focus, and this year, projects have been prioritized using the new carbon budget prioritization process. The 10-year capital plan makes investments in climate mitigation and adaptation actions aimed at reducing about 161,000 tons of CO2 emissions, while also improving resiliency to climate change. Key actions across key sectors include buildings as the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Toronto, The city is focused on reducing emissions from buildings to have a meaningful impact on the city's climate objectives. Mobility and fleet, there are a wide range of projects across the city divisions and agencies which positively contribute to the city's climate goals, including investments in bike share and TTC green bus procurement. Investments are also being made by our rate programs, including the basement flooding protection program and investments at the Dufferin Organics Processing Facility. And finally, there are other actions to achieve greater resiliency, including the Portland's flood protection project, stream restoration and erosion control, and enhanced green spaces. I'd also like to note that for the first time, we will be presenting on our citywide investments in climate action during our program reviews taking place this Wednesday, January 15th, and there'll be an ability to be able to speak to all of our climate change actions and be able to ask any of the questions detailed across citywide perspective. So, the City of Toronto was on a challenged financial path, which couldn't keep pace with the growing number of capital and operating pressures. As the economic engine of Ontario and Canada, the path we were on, the challenge we faced, were truly unique to Toronto. Torontonians have stepped up to do all they could, but it was clear that the city could not change direction alone or overnight. Now, as we enter the second year of our multi-year approach to budgeting, we are beginning down a new path that has already started to enhance our future financial stability. This year's operating budget of $18.8 billion maintains services and service levels while making key investments in areas we heard were most important to Torontonians, making life affordable, providing community services, getting Toronto moving, and keeping people safe. The 10-year capital plan of almost $60 billion continues to prioritize investments in state of good repair while making advancements in transit, housing, and community infrastructure. With the support of our federal and provincial partners, we've been able to increase our investments in critical capital infrastructure by almost 20% compared to last year, while still staying within our debt service limits. Because of this, we're starting to see the flattening of our SOGR growth curve and continuing to also advance our climate actions. Okay, there's a lot. So I'll just quickly run us through the budget schedule before I fully wrap things up. I'll take a moment to go over the upcoming dates that we have available. Later this week, from January 15th to 17th, you'll receive presentations from service areas and key agencies. The city will, for the second year now, be hosting telephone town halls, providing more opportunities for residents to participate in the budget process. These will happen in the evenings of January 15th and the 23rd and provide another opportunity to connect with our community. On February 21st and 22nd, I believe that's January, there will be another opportunity for the public to participate through deputations to the Budget Committee. On January 24th, we'll have a wrap-up Budget Committee meeting to review our future budget materials and answer any final questions that people may have. Then there will be a special City Council meeting on February 11th to discuss the budget following the Mayor's release of our final proposed budget by February 1st. We really do encourage people to get involved in the budget process. Following from the fall budget consultations, there are still opportunities to hear feedback and input from residents and businesses. This includes the telephone town halls that I just mentioned, speaking to Budget Committee on January 21st and 22nd, through written feedback to Budget Committee, or you can always contact your local councillor.
When it comes to the balancing actions, you list off the number of things to deal with that opening pressure. Can you just explain, maybe in the plainest terms possible, what is a temporary bridging strategy?
Sure, I'll jump in. So in the simplest of terms, that would be us essentially drawing from a reserve, but doing it in a manner where we're not just managing the amount we're drawing this year, we're looking at the amount that we can scale down over a few years, while we then over time replace it with other actions that might be coming forward as part of the long-term financial plan or other offsets or reductions to be able to compensate for that temporary measure that we put in place over this period of time within our multi-year approach.
So when you talk about a reserve, is this like that big nest egg that people were pointing to say, like, listen, why don't you just spend on that for the entire thing? But you were, I know in previous budgets there's been concern about tapping that all out all at once. So just can you clarify how much money is in that reserve at the moment?
Yeah, so this is a reserve that we did start building up during the pandemic and have slowly been bringing it down. What we're drawing from is 330 million. The reserve itself is called the Budget Bridging and Balancing Reserve. It was created last year, where we consolidate all those funds. After this year's draw, there should still be about maybe 30 million or so left in the reserve, but again, that is part of our multi-year strategy in terms of being able to continue to draw that down in 2026.
Hi, I'm Alexander with Alexander Stravko with Taxi News. My question today is this budget considering any sort of retirement package for elderly cabbies whose plates have also lost all their value?
Yeah, the short answer is there is no funding that's included in the budget for that.
Okay. Does this budget contain funds for a centralized dispatch for accessible taxis? And if so, how much?
So in December, when that issue was brought forward, that was referred back to staff. So we'll be bringing some of that information forward in 2025. The budget implications for that would be considered at that time and would be an in-year adjustment. So at this stage, we've not had council approval to move in that direction. Council has asked, however, that come back fairly quickly, and we will do so in 2025.
Got it. Thank you.
Hi there, Matt Asabibinya, Toronto Star. Could you just break down the math for us in really simple terms, how much the 6.9% will generate in revenue for the city this year?
Sure. So this year, a 6.9% property tax increase. So 5.4 is expected to generate 251 million. And then on the city building fund, the additional 1.5, I'll have to call up the number, I think it was around 58 million or so. So we would combine the two, and that would be the total amount that we would generate. So every 1% generates 46.4. So the combined, and I apologize because I've only looked at the amount that goes into the operating off the top of my head, but 46.4 times 6.9 would be about 320 million in additional revenue generated.
And so we try and be really clear that there's a combined property tax increase of the 6.9, so it's clear, but it is important that we break it down into the two components, because sometimes people will say, well, is that entire 6.9, for instance, going towards recreation service or others? And the short answer is no. 5.4% of that is on the operating side. Those are the things like the daily services that people receive. The 1.5 specific for capital is going for that. However, when you combine it, for those that are paying property taxes, it's at 6.9%. So we appreciate you breaking it down, but then also, we can combine it, as Steve says, and say that's essentially on a capital and operating budget. That's what we're generating for each year. But I do know that in talking to folks in the community, they say, well, is that entire 6.9 going towards those things like those day-to-day services? And the answer is no. That's why we talk about a 5.4% operating and the 1.5% on the capital side.
And then what was your response to residents or even members of council who are wondering about why the rate is still so high this year? Last year it was the historic 9.5 was justified as, we're playing catch up after years of underinvestment. But, some councillors are calling this one a self-inflicted budget. They would have liked to seen it much lower at maybe 5%, given the last 2 years. It's been almost over double the rate of inflation. What is your response to that criticism?
So one of the things that we did signal last year is that we're on a multi-year pathway for that, and that does include the property taxes being part of that multi-year approach. It's also why we went to the provincial and federal government and said, you need to be on board for a multi-year approach. This can't be 1 year and you hope it all gets better in that 1 year. We understand affordability. We heard that very clearly from Torontonians, but we also understand the need not to affect service delivery. So if you look at the balance in this budget, much of this is to maintain the service levels that we see here in the City of Toronto. There are some targeted new investments in some areas that people talked about being underinvested in. And so I think we've tried to strike that balance. It is on the downward trajectory. And I understand the debate now will be, and the feedback to the mayor as she prepares her final budget for submission on February the 1st will be, what's that right rate to be at? But I think what Torontonians can, hopefully take a bit of solace in, I won't say pleasure in, but solace in, is that we are on that downward trajectory in two ways. One is the opening pressure won't be quite as significant for us in terms of the things we have to do to balance that off. And then secondly, we will be able to continue to look at property tax increases that can drop as well over time.
Hi, Sarah McMillan with CBC. Just hoping to get some more details on the reductions and offsets. Can you provide some examples of some of the specifics of those reductions?
Sure. So in total, what we've identified in this year's budget is $680 million in reductions and offsets. So they're not all reductions. When we look specifically at reductions, there's $93 million through line-by-line actions. So that's where our staff will work with our colleagues in divisions or agency budgets, and we'll look at each line item within our budget. That would be within our salaries and benefit lines, materials and supplies, services and rents, down to the commitment item, and look at the history over the last 5 years or so. What's been spent against what our expectations are in 2025. So that was done on the line-by-line side. And then there's true efficiencies, so actually reduced costs in terms of delivering services that we provide today. That's $41 million. Within that $41 million, the largest impact is renegotiating our hotel contracts that we use as part of our shelter supports. In doing that, we've been able to save about $30 million alone through some of those renegotiated contracts. There's also been a series of other actions that have happened within our different divisions. One of the ones was our technology services, where again, we looked at our system applications, we looked at the level of usage, and either eliminated, decommissioned some of the applications, or again, looked to renegotiate contracts. On fleet services side, there was retreading of tires, there was looking at underutilized vehicles. We even had some debt service savings that I mentioned in the presentation because of our higher credit rating. So those were some of the actions that actually resulted in reduced costs. Beyond that, there's what we call program and agency reviews. That's essentially when the submissions come into us across all the city divisions and agencies. Our financial staff in the city work with our counterparts in the agencies and divisions and essentially play a challenge function. We'll look at what is coming forward as a cost. We'll validate the cost. We'll look at timing assumptions. We'll look at some of the cost estimates. We'll look at it through a lens of affordability or prioritization. And within those actions, there was about $294 million. All the other actions were more revenue related. It might have been assessment growth or user fees or different actions that were of a revenue nature.
Thank you. I also have one small question about the TTC budget. I know one of the pages in the presentation, it mentioned $94 million in gross new and enhanced initiatives. I'm curious how much of the $85 million approximate increase to the TTC is captured in that new and enhanced initiatives?
Sure. Off memory, and I'll get you the exact number in a second. So between our Wheel-Trans services and our conventional services, I think there's about $15.2 million that you can capture as part of the enhancements.
Thank you.
Hi there, Alan Carter with City News. Just further to the $680 million, I know you answered some of this, but could you perhaps help us understand how that will be rolled out? Budget chief talked that it would be spread over a series of years to minimize the impact.
So the 680 that we identified in offsets and reductions, those are offsets and reductions that are factored in the 2025 budget. So all of those were factored and strategies to bring down that opening pressure we faced of $1.2 billion. So this is no different. Last year we had identified probably around 600 million or so. It's an action we continue to have to take on an annual budget process. So we would expect to find more and do more next year. It'll be part of the messages after this budget's approved. But that 680 is fully reflected in 2025.
Hey guys, Aiden Shmandi from Toronto Today here. So, we're openly talking about New Deal, I guess, version 2 now, but we don't really have a ton of details from you guys. I'm wondering if you could provide a bit more insight on kind of exactly what you're looking for, or timelines on negotiations, because the budget does include some timing assumptions on that.
So sure, and the new deal that was signed off by the Premier and the Mayor included language about the timeframes. So in 2025, we've committed, and in the first quarter, we will land the terms of reference around that, and that's the same similar process. Last time round, we had a terms of reference, and then we got down to the business of talking and negotiating to some degree and understanding each other's position. This will take much longer. So I think the message I need to leave today is that unlike the last time round where we were getting together and sitting down in October for a budget that started to be launched in January and needed that funding immediately, was a different set of circumstances. And that's why you didn't see some of these things as a fully sustainable approach, because we simply didn't have the time. So I can see through 2025 and into 2026 that we'll continue those conversations. They're going to be much more detailed because clearly, I'm not going to get into, what's coming to the table because we don't know that quite yet. But the reality is what is going to come to the table at the end of the day will have to be something that is more than a 2 or 3 year piece, right? If we're talking about those core areas again, transit, housing, homelessness, the increasing costs around our emergency services, we need a strategy that looks at how will that be sustained. And so another part of the conversation that will be a little bit different than perhaps the last time is we'll also have to think through how will that investment be realized? And is that through additional revenue tools or a revenue sharing that looks a bit different? So these conversations will be longer. So to come back, first quarter of this year, we'll have the terms of reference in place. We then begin the conversations in earnest. This won't happen until into 2026. The funding we have in place today is there until December 31st of 2026. So really this is a lead up to be ready for our 2027 budget. But we're both committed, and they committed in the New Deal, that this won't be that we're doing this in December of 2026, getting ready for January. We hope to be a little bit sooner on that.
And just so I have this clear, like when you're talking about a little bit more sustained funding from this round, when you say that, are we talking like maybe a 10-year time horizon or kind of in perpetuity? Some of these issues will be kind of solved.
So, pretty clearly we'd like some of these to be solved forever. So actually a shift in the way that we have a relationship that would be a forever shift in that. But as I've said on previous occasions to this question, how we get there, there's many different pathways, but what we don't want to be doing is every 3 years, or I would even suggest to you every decade, that we have to sit down and figure this out again. It's time that with the provincial government in particular, because that is our relationship as a municipality, but also with the federal government on certain key items, that we find a way to support the sustained financial situation of the City of Toronto. And that is not the sustainability of everything we do from stem to stern. This is about talking about those key areas that really do impact us on a year-by-year basis. And I've reiterated them, and Steve's reiterated them many, many times. So we're going to continue to focus in on those things that are pretty unique to Toronto. Those are the things that keep us from being wholly sustainable. We would like not to do this ever again. I can tell you that other orders of government probably would not like to have this conversation regularly either. The trick will be, how do we get ourselves to a place where most of this is solved in some kind of a renewed relationship that isn't contingent on who's in power and isn't contingent on a granting cycle that often becomes problematic for us.
Sean Jefford, CBC News. Paul, Stephen, I don't know which one of you guys might be able to give us these details, but I'm wondering if you can tell us what the financial terms of the recent CUPE deal are for the city. We've been, as media, asking questions about it, but are pointed to this budget for that answer. What's it going to cost taxpayers?
Do you want me to? Yeah, I'll start. So we have set aside provision for the CUPE deal. We are still negotiating. We're still negotiating both with our paramedics union. We're negotiating with our Local 79 union. I can note that the provision we've set aside is adequate to be able to address the settlement. The settlement's also within our mandate. Unfortunately, because we have ongoing negotiations, we're not able to divulge the exact amount that we've set aside.
What about 416, though? There is an agreement in place there, right? It was trumpeted by the city in December, but no financial terms disclosed.
So there's an agreement with a portion of 416, and we are still negotiating with 416. So no, the entire deal did not come forward. We're still working on that. And that, again, is why we're not releasing those details until such time as we've concluded those negotiations with all of 416. So there was a portion there, but the negotiations continue. And because it's an overall envelope in there, we're just going to continue to do our work with 416. once we get to an agreement, and those things tend to happen the disclosure is a period of time after that, no different than with the TTC and what happened there and other parts of our union. So we just really want to protect all involved that are continuing to work through this agreement process.
Sorry, I'm going to impose on the good graces of my colleagues and ask one more follow-up here. When it comes to the broader envelope for collective bargaining agreements in this budget, can you give us any sense, any ballpark? I mean, the mayor was there this morning surrounded by city workers, all of whom presumably are going to get raises this year. What's that going to cost taxpayers?
The total? Yeah, sure. So it is we do have many of our collective bargaining units that are negotiating this year. We've set provisions aside in our non-program accounts across the entire city. Those provisions are in and around a $300 million impact across all of our different unions, including some of those that have already settled.
Hi, Natalie Johnson, CTV News. The mayor is touting this property tax increase as protecting the 50% of Torontonians who are renters, but in practical terms, will a residential property tax hike not just be absorbed by the landlord by being passed down to tenants?
So something we've done this year, and it's actually part of the policy work we did on our multi-residential rate, is not to get into too much technicalities here, but there's a threshold that you'd have to hit before you're able to reduce or match a multi-residential rate to that of a residential. We've deliberately kept the multi-res rate at half of the increase of the residential. The reason being is there's provincial rent guidelines that indicate how much a landlord can increase rent by. There's also triggers that would enable rent to be increased above those guidelines. We looked at our increase with consideration of those guidelines to ensure our increase in property tax rates for multi-residential properties would not trigger that guideline or that rent increase on its own above the 2.5%, which is already the provincial guideline that's in place and available to landlords.
So if a landlord was renting out a single-family home or a single condo, for example, do they fall within the multi-res rate, or they would just have a standard
No,
property
so a
tax?
multi-res rate is specific to the multi-residential property class. If somebody owns a home or owns a condo unit and is renting it out, those properties fall in the residential property class and they'd be assessed as a residential property.
So ultimately, some renters then could still be hit by the property tax increase indirectly.
Depending, there'd be a lot of factors, but
Sure.
the property tax increase on those residential properties, even if rented, would be at the 5.4 plus 1.5%.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's important to note in this budget also, it includes the incentives that were passed through the fall by council in terms of building more rental housing. And so while that's, it's all related to the property tax increases as well, or the property tax rates, but we're going to see new construction of rental units in this city, all of whom, with the incentive program that came forward in the fall, will have a level of affordability attached to them, and also that they will remain in that format as affordable units for a minimum of 40 years. And our hope is that we continue to negotiate to that 99-year threshold that we like to see within our program. So the fact of the matter is this budget, yes, there's a property tax implication, and Steve's walked through how that impacts renters differently. But the other side is it includes the investment that the City of Toronto is making in those incentives so that we can continue to build rental housing for Torontonians.
Hello, Momin Qureshi, 680 News. Not surprisingly, after the news conference this morning, there were some councillors who came out who were a bit put off by the property tax proposal, saying that they felt that it should be somewhere closer to the rate of inflation. So I wanted to ask you guys, if there was a property tax imposed at the rate of inflation this time around, what kind of impact would that have on the books, city services, the whole deal, if that's what the mayor decided to go with?
So, the short answer is it would have a significant impact. I guess the question would be, is that the combined piece that would be at a level of inflation? Because 1.5% of that council's approved for a decade of that capital levy. If we're just talking on the operating side, 1% change is about $46 million. That has to come from somewhere, or it has to be replaced by something else. So, the only two tools we have is to look at fees and other revenue pieces to which we have the total control as the City of Toronto. We've looked at most of those, as you folks know. The second piece is that we would have to reduce services or our expenses by some level. So the math becomes, what really is it? Is the combined rate? Is it just on the operating side? And then the budget would have to be adjusted accordingly. We have no choice but to balance. So for every percentage drop, it's $46 million. It needs to be found somewhere else within the budget.
So I guess my follow-up then is it at this point, whether it's combined or just operating at the rate of inflation, is something that is pretty unrealistic for the city to look at this point, given the budget pressures and what needs to be done?
So the parameters that we looked at, yes, very difficult, because the parameters were, we didn't want to see large impacts to the services that are offered today, but also wanted to see some investment in certain areas, and both of those statements would be at risk if there's a significant reduction in the amount of revenue that's coming in.
Ben Spur from the Toronto Star. The budget presentation lists 276 new positions, I believe it is, for emergency services. Could you give a breakdown of which departments are getting each of those positions?
Just give me a second. Steve's got it somewhere in the binder.
You just give us the binder.
Don't you wish?
I can answer that question. No, Ben, you won't be getting the binder after this briefing. Make sure that's on the public record.
So within our emergency services, frontline paramedics, we're adding 95, frontline firefighters, 52, and frontline police uniform officers, 109.
And you talked about the efforts that the city has made to find savings and efficiencies in this budget, but the budget is going up by $1.8 billion compared to last year. What do you say to councillors or members of the public who look at that and say the city is not actually reining in spending? That's an unsustainable increase.
So the first thing is really important that $1.8 billion is put in the context of a gross increase, because as I mentioned this morning, between 800 and 900 million of that is actually government flow through that if it didn't happen, it would have no impact on the property taxpayers. So we're talking about $570 million invested through the federal and provincial governments through the Canada-wide early learning and childcare program. So that means we wouldn't be lowering childcare fees if that wasn't coming from the government. It wouldn't mean a reduction in property taxes. Same with the increasing caseloads within the employment and social service area. So there is a huge amount of that $1.8 billion increase. And believe me, when I first saw it on paper, I kind of knew that it was going to be big. That's 10.5% increase in the overall budget. But when you break it down to what are the city services, those that we really had some control in, where those investments are going, it's 3.8%, which when you factor in a collective bargaining year, which when you factor in some of the increases in the agencies such as the Toronto Community Housing and the TTC, means that there's an awful lot of constraint that was put in there across all of the divisions of the City of Toronto. So I felt much more comfortable looking at what is the real increase in terms of our city services, then recognizing we get a whole bunch of 100% flow through from other orders of government. Some of that's great news, some of that's just a sign of the times. And then we do have these internal transfers, which again, if they weren't to occur, does not necessarily mean that there's going to be a savings for the Toronto taxpayer, nor does it mean it's runaway spending by the City of Toronto and the services that we provide. I think you're looking at a very modest increase in terms of all the pressures that are on our services, in particular in a collective bargaining year. All of those pressures at 3.8% increase, I think it's a reasonable expectation that we have for those programs.
So I think we've gone through everyone who's been at the mic once. Are there any further questions? Going once, going twice. Okay, well, thanks everyone for being here today. Any further questions can be sent to media@toronto.ca. Public feedback sessions are going to take place Tuesday, January 21st and Wednesday, January 22nd. The city is also going to host telephone town halls on Wednesday, January 15th and Thursday, January 23rd, so we can hear from members of the public. The Budget Committee's wrap-up meeting is Friday, January 24th, followed by the special City Council meeting on Tuesday, February 11th. So thank you all for being with us today, and thanks for Steve and Paul for answering the questions. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Also follow us on social media, and for more information, check out our website.